Don't say that I never listen. I'm well aware that this has pretty much been the most requested video since day one. I've been asked so many times, when's Streets of Rage coming? When are you going to do it? Is it now? Well, what about now? You get the picture. This channel did start out mostly covering Mega Drive games after all, and even if I don't often go down that road these days, I've still always wanted to do Streets of Rage, but various circumstances have always put it to one side. Until now. Finally, we're doing it. My favourite series of beat 'em up games by far, nothing even comes close. 3 games all with their own unique touches. It's a no-brainer. Some of the finest games to ever come out on Sega's Black Beauty. So yeah, let's just go for it. Origins wise, it's a pretty simple story. The Mega Drive was all about bringing the arcade experience home. It had tried to do that first off with ports of all the best known arcade games from Sega, with varying degrees of success. Beat 'em ups had already worked out quite well. The Mega Drive's port of Golden Axe, something that was covered ages ago, was perhaps the most successful attempt. Still, Sega didn't really have all that many big beat 'em ups beyond that. The likes of Capcom and Konami ruled the genre, which was still the biggest thing going in the arcades around about 1991. Golden Axe was a great beat 'em up, but it was also Sega's only real success in the genre. No one got excited for ports of arcade also-rans like Alien Storm, not when compared to big sellers like the SNES's version of Final Fight, which came out in Japan in December of 1990. It may not have had multiplayer, but it was still a port of what was one of the biggest games in the world at this point. Sega needed to respond with a big beat 'em up for their machine, but they would need to create it from scratch and they needed it quick. No time for an arcade one, it had to go straight to the Mega Drive. Still, it was a natural fit. Sega were already trying to stand out from Nintendo any way they could, and one of the ways was by being more, well, cool. Grittier and darker. Well, as much as they could be anyway.
If you're not playing these games, you're a giant loser.
To be more precise, they wanted the games to feel as modern as possible, so that they could outbox Nintendo on sheer attitude alone. The biggest example of this was, of course, in the pipeline, but there were others. The Revenge of Shinobi, another successful early MD title, is a pretty big pointer to the sort of feel that Sega wanted in their flagship beat 'em up. No fantasy, a bit of movie savvy, a different sort of soundtrack. Basically avoid anything that wouldn't make Nintendo squirm a little in their eyes. In your face was the order of the day. No half-stepping, no cute, doing what Nintendo would. Yeah, whatever. The team behind the game, AM7, was a mix of folks who'd worked on 2 games in particular, the aforementioned Revenge of Shinobi and the Mega Drive port of eSWAT. So the team already had plenty of experience of taking arcade properties and making them feel brand new and much darker for the home, and both games showed off exactly what Sega were looking for in their beat 'em up. They wanted something like Final Fight, Double Dragon and what have you, but with a different sort of feel. Nothing cartoony, nothing fantastical, much more cinematic and war. Even the original Japanese title, Bare Knuckle, says it all. It's down and dirty, a wet straightener on the cobbles. Your heroes aren't martial artists, they're ex-police officers, Adam, Axel and Blaze, and they're here to wipe the scum off the streets and take down a big crime syndicate headed up by a guy simply known as Mr. X. And wait a minute, why ex-police officers? Well, naturally everything else is choked by bureaucracy and corruption, including the Force. All the official channels are hopeless, so you've got to do things the 80s action way. These guys handed in their badge and gun so they could get the job done. If you cast your mind back to the video I did on heroic bloodshed, it's not all that dissimilar. It's not like there's much plot, but what's here is all about striking back, and all about brotherhood. In fact, you know what really makes Bare Knuckles stand out from other beat 'em ups of the time? It's kind of similar to what would eventually make Sonic stand out actually, purposefully so. It doesn't feel Japanese, at all. In fact, it feels very Western. That was the second big aim. As 1991 rolled on, Sega knew that they couldn't win at home, no matter what, but they had their eyes on whipping the American market right out from under Nintendo's noses. Sonic would lead the charge, but other games would support it, and of those, Streets of Rage, as it would be called everywhere else, was by far the most important, the one that would end up showing that Sonic was not a fluke. And how does all of this translate into a game? Well, it's a hard hitter right from the off. The first Streets of Rage is kind of all about impact. The one thing that sticks out to me about the game is just how clanny everything is, how every hit just bangs and it feels like there's so much impact behind every blow. Streets of Rage takes notes from Final Fight by keeping the moveset fairly straightforward, with simple attacks and throws leading the way, but otherwise the fighting feels totally different. Streets of Rage is much more slower paced, a considered fighting game that's not about enemies trying to brute force you, but more about them running in groups and picking at you. They hide on the sidelines then swoop in. Most of the game's enemies play that way. It's a very rangy beat 'em up where you've got to be smart and force enemies' hands in order to close the distance. This isn't so much a differentiation from Final Fight as it is from Sega's other famous beat 'em up. Compare this to the much more straightforward Golden Axe. They couldn't be any more different in how they play, even without the swords and whatnot. This is all about high ground and counter hitting, approaching from the side and all of that. Combos aren't nearly as effective as grabs and throws, and tiny little tech touches like pressing up and C to reverse an enemy's throw are so important. And like any good fighting game, there's also weapons. You get your bog standard knife, bat and pipe, but you're also provided with a very satisfying bottle, which smashes the first time you use it, and of all things, a pepper pot. This can stun an enemy and allow you to get some free hits in, which sounds like a move straight out of Bas Wooten's playbook.
Don't you ever do this.
Of course, you do also get a special for when things get really hairy, and it's awesome. A couple of your cop buddies roll up in a car and scorch the area with napalm. No warrants needed, motherfucker. These guys are apparently the only good cops in the whole city, and damn, well, let's just say it's a good thing that they're on your side. They're even in the ending, that's how good they are. And yeah, you're gonna need those specials. This game is a considerable challenge, one of the hardest beat 'em ups around. The way enemies fight means that even basic trash mobs can be a huge nuisance, particularly when paired with the game's tough bosses. Stage 2's Souther should be more than enough to let you know that this game doesn't screw around, and if it wasn't, then the dreaded Blaze palette swap sisters on Stage 5, Mona and Lisa? Oh boy, they'll definitely eat your lunch. I still have nightmares about those two. And in the final stage, well, you gotta go through all of them again, and you don't even get any specials to help you out. It's tempting just to click yes at the end when Mr. X asks you if you want to be his right-hand man. Although all that happens is you end up getting busted back to round 6. It can be a different story if you're in 2-player mode though. So yeah, the game is very hard, and truthfully it can feel a little unfair at times. Sometimes the hitboxes can feel a bit off, you can take hits without knowing what the hell happened, and the fighters can feel a little unequipped. If Streets of Rage needs something for sure, it's a good crowd control move. Gameplay wise though, the game is still quite good, even if it does feel kind of outdated today when compared to some of its contemporaries, what with the choppiness of the graphics and all that. But it was definitely enough for Sega and most people to be happy. But all that said, Streets of Rage would be nothing without its presentation, cause they just nailed everything they tried to go for there. Streets of Rage's muted art style just works. First off, there's seemingly the conscious decision that everything should take place at night. Literally no stage of the game is set during daytime. All the colours are suitably bare as a result. The first stage with its neon signs and the like is a definite classic, but even the second stage, the more subtle back streets with trash flying about, brilliant. It suits the game's feel to a T. The enemies look quite good on the whole too. Takes on the usual formula with a bit more street punk thrown in. A bunch of them look like jobbing extras from Akira, which is fun. Most of the enemies here would make it to later games in souped up forms or slight variations, which tells you how well they thought of their original mob. In fact, the boss of the first stage is the only one who didn't appear in another game. An odd guy with a fluffy jacket and a boomerang of all things. Yeah, poor him. But one aspect of the presentation needs space all of its own, and that is, of course, the music. If one thing above all else gives Streets of Rage the low-down, dirty feel that Sega wanted, it's Yuzo Koshiro's soundtrack, which sounds like no game that had come before. Most beat-em-ups used to stick to video game style rock for their soundtrack, or as close as they could get. Koshiro went another way. He clubbed a lot and was well into his dance music and raving, and so he filled Streets of Rage with all that. All 3 games have a different style about them, and the first game is predominantly 4-to-the-floor house. The tempo's all about matching your heartbeat. The game's signature Never Return Alive boss theme lays it all out in the opening. Yuzo Koshiro's instruments are also all about the house style, synth patches that wouldn't have sounded out of place on a new groove record, and that almighty swoop-in house piano which you can hear in the main theme. Oh, just amazing. If I had to pick a favourite though, gotta be the Stage 8 theme. Just listen. This is house music with serious swagger, almost on the verge of R&B in fact. It swings, it's got a fantastic bass line, incredible track. It turned out that the Mega Drive could do house music pretty well. Thinking about it technically, that's not a big surprise. The Mega Drive did after all use a Yamaha YM2612 sound chip that relied on FM synthesis, frequency modulation to get really technical. Basically it's the same sort of process that powered iconic synthesizers like the Yamaha DX7, which you'll find in about 500,000 popular 80s tracks. And with that heritage, it's no great surprise that the Mega Drive could do things like electric piano or big synth leads really well, much better than it could, say, emulate an electric guitar. In the hands of someone like Yuzo Koshiro, the Mega Drive's sound chip was dynamite, and the result, in the case of Streets of Rage, was 3 of the greatest game soundtracks ever. Yeah, I said 3, but we'll get to that later. For now, we can say that Streets of Rage succeeded at what it was set to do. After the huge success of Sonic, it led the second charge in the West and showed that the Mega Drive, or Genesis, was here and it was serious competition for Nintendo. The fight was now very much on. And of course it gave Sega a brand new successful IP. Streets of Rage was here to stay now, and naturally a sequel was going to come out pretty sharpish. It didn't take long at all. Streets of Rage 2 hit the shelves the very next year. A bunch more people worked on it too, with extra power coming from the Ancient team. And of course there was still the AM7 lot and Yuzo Koshiro. Still, sequels are always a tricky business, even if there was certainly room for improvement. No need to change much about the plot, I guess. Mr. X is still very much at large, and this time he's kidnapped Adam. Axel and Blaze are joined by 2 new characters, Skate, Adam's younger brother, and Max, Axel's wrestler friend. And so, rage burning inside them, they go out and walk the streets once again. Streets of Rage 2 is, well, let's just go ahead and say it. It's the best game on the Mega Drive, and the best side-scrolling beat-em-up ever made. Bar none. It's a massive improvement over the original game in every area. Seriously, there's no place where this doesn't outstrip the first game. I suppose that what's immediately notable is the graphics. An average mook in the second game is now just as big and as detailed as a boss from the first one, and the second game's bosses are even more detailed than that. Not only is every goon from the second game given a graphical update, but there's so much more variation in them too. The first game didn't really have all that many goons to fight, but this one has a ton. Aside from the regular thugs, you've got ninjas, martial artists, baseball-loving fat boys, knife-wielding gutter punks, kickboxers, bikers, robots, and they all look stunning. You can just see the improvements. Souther from SOR1 has certainly been given a makeover, returning here as Blanca, Zamza. Then there's the Signal Gang, which is probably my favourite when it comes to the updated mook designs. I just love that jacket and mohawk. SOR2 sadly lacks the first game's fire and axe throwing clones, but they've been retooled too, as the gutter punk Jack, complete with awesome laugh. Another shocking redesign is Abadidi. Yeah. Stocky and kind of ugly in the first game, he's now an Ultimate Warrior-esque behemoth. And the rather odd-looking martial artist folks from SOR1 have been re-rolled up into a ball and turned into Shiva, perhaps the most awesome-looking of all the game's villains. What's more, they all now have their names and energy bars proudly on display too, bringing the game right in line with arcade beat-em-up conventions. Needless to say, the main characters get the same treatment as well. They all look great, but there's way more to them now. One negative about the first game was that the 3 characters all played rather similarly. Aside from slight statistical nods towards speed and power, they weren't that different. Well, not so here. Axel and Blaze return as the 2 all-rounders with slight leanings towards power and speed respectively, but Max and Skate totally changed the game. Max is muscle-bound and incredibly sluggish, but it doesn't matter. He destroys opponents with his combos and grabs. He may not be able to vault like the other characters, but the variety of his throws means that it doesn't matter. If you can hit the atomic drop, game over. As slow as he is, Max's attacks are monstrously powerful, and if you can work his slide, closing the distance isn't even an issue. To be honest, he's basically the game's easy mode. Skate is the opposite. He has no strength and his grabs aren't much use, but he's incredibly fast. In fact, he's the only character who can run, and not only are those attacks super useful, but he can evade attacks that everyone else can't. His lack of energy makes him harder to play with, but he is satisfying to learn. All the characters definitely make for their own experience, which is really something, and it's helped by the wide variety of moves on offer. Now sadly the Napalm Sporting Cop car doesn't return, but you get a whole load of specials instead. Remember how I said that crowd control moves were kind of an issue in the first game? Not so here. Every character has two specials, an A button crowd control special and an A button plus direction special that's much stronger, usually a multi-hit combo, but takes off energy whenever you use it. The basic A button special only takes off energy if it connects. You also get a very useful dash double tap forward plus B attack. These are evasive and will ruin anyone in front of you, Max's slide, Skate's dash, and of course Axel's Grand Opera. And finally there's a B and C rear attack, a couple of jump attacks, and at least 2 throws per character. You can mix all this up with the basic attacks for some seriously punishing combos. There's so much to play with and just so much fun. The characters even handle weapons differently. Blaze has a specific knife combo, Max can hit people on both sides with a pipe, because he's obviously not OP enough, and so forth. Every character has their own style and identity, making them all uniquely fun to toy around with. All of this means that Streets of Rage 2 is actually a lot easier than the first game, although it feels more balanced rather than just being unfair. The enemies do still go about their business in a similar way, although they are more aggressive this time out, and there are definitely some battles that will really give you a hard time, particularly bosses like Abadidi, Arbear and Shiva. Ugh, the lives spent on those motherfuckers, seriously. Airborne bosses like Jet and huge biker and kickboxer trash mobs will also happily ruin your day if you're not careful. Still, on the whole, I do pretty well at this game. I can complete it on hard most of the time, and I've even managed to complete it on hardest in 2-player. Sure, I died before the final boss went down and the job had to be finished by someone who's a lot better at Streets of Rage 2 than I am, but I'm obviously still counting it. The game's difficulty is great though, just offering those big challenges here and there, but nothing that's like a brick wall. And it's just so fun, especially with another player. It's absolutely one of my favourite multiplayer games of all time. You could ask how it manages to be totally unique to every other beat 'em up, and hell, maybe it isn't in a lot of ways. But there's just something about the whole package that comes together beautifully. It also has to be said that as much as the gameplay's improved, the art's improved too, and that didn't even need much work. But perhaps the backgrounds in the first game could be a little samey from time to time. Things like the boat level or even the finale inside Mr. X's compound weren't superb lookers. SOR2 comes with tons of variation here. Levels now have loads of different stages. Just look at the first level for example. You go from the streets, to a bar, to a back alley fight in the pouring rain. Round 3 takes you through an amusement park, inside an arcade, through a pirate attraction, and ultimately to a ghost house. Just so much to love. How about round 4, where you end up in a baseball stadium and then take a secret elevator on home plate down to an underground fighting arena? The first game would have needed about 30 separate levels to pull all of this off. And of course, it's music time. Yuzo Koshiro's outdone himself here. Every track is gold. Some of them, like bar hopping, actually move away from the dance fair, but on the whole it's just pounding. Compared to the house of the first game, SOR2 goes all techno, with big wobbly bass lines and a much faster pace. But there's room for some house stuff still. Stage 3's Swooping Dreamer is one of my favourites. And you even get some dark hip-hop sort of stuff. Stage 4's Too Deep has that awesome synth. Actually sounds kind of like Rebel Without a Pause, don't you think? But the most memorable tracks are the ones that hit hard, like Spin on the Bridge or Alien Power. Got that bass line. And then there's this Expander from stage 7. Christ. If this were a club, it would be time to go absolutely fucking ballistic. This might be my favourite song in the whole series actually, just so good. You could play virtually all of this soundtrack on a techno night without remixing it and it wouldn't sound out of place. Yuzo Koshiro's masterpiece and the greatest video game soundtrack ever, for me at least. Yeah, it's my favourite. Maybe that's why I love the game so much. I'd go with that, but then I'd go for loads of other reasons too. It's just a very special game for me. If I had to pick one game that defined the entire system for me, it'd be Streets of Rage 2. If I could only take one cut to a desert island, it'd be Streets of Rage 2, assuming that the EverDrive was disallowed of course. Streets of Rage 2 was perhaps the reason why this video was so long in the making too. When faced with one of your very favourite games, you want to make sure that you do it justice. And I hope I have. Streets of Rage 2 is a favourite for a lot of people in fact. It was a big hit, critically worshipped, and remains one of the system's best loved titles. If the first game didn't establish Streets of Rage as a major player, then the second one certainly did. 1992. A glorious time to be aboard the Sega train. Sonic 2 had a lot to do with that too, but mainly, gotta go with this. Rage 2 is kin. And of course, yep, there had to be a Streets of Rage 3. This would take a bit longer to come out, arriving about 18 months after the second game in the middle of 1994, right as the Mega Drive was in its prime years. And again, it promised to be so much better than what came before. Kind of a tall order this time out, I'm sure you'll agree. Streets of Rage 3 was basically meant to be massive from the outset. Sega threw everything at it. One look at the graphics says it all. The amount of colour and detail they tried to eke out of the now battle-worn Mega Drive is undeniable. It even, in a rare move for a beat-em-up, has cutscenes and a somewhat substantial plot. The opening cutscene says it all. Wood Oak City is rocked by a massive chemical explosion, killing tens of thousands of people. The heroes who saved the day twice before are back again, with the very real threat of destruction hanging over them. Funnily enough though, if you're from the West, then this opening cutscene may not be familiar to you. Well, that's because it's taken from the Japanese version of the game, Bare Knuckle 3. This part of the plot was completely cut from the Western version. In the West, the emphasis is on the Syndicate returning for a third time, complete with a plan to replace important public figures with robots who are under their control. The bombing part is barely mentioned. Either way, you can be sure exactly who's behind all of it. And our heroes are mostly the same too. Axel, Blaze and Skate all return, and they're all good at precisely what they were good at before, but alas, there's no Max. He's replaced by Dr. Zan, part robot, part man, all doctor. He used to work for the Syndicate but has now turned good. He's quite interesting to play as actually. His slides and what have you make him one of the easier characters to do well with. Oh, and as for Adam, he's busy apparently. Washing his hair, playing Dota, wanking, who the hell knows. He's not in the game either. As it turns out, there are a lot of differences between Streets of Rage 3 and Bare Knuckle 3. There have been odd differences in the past. Plenty of folks used to yelp about how you could see Blazer's panties in Bare Knuckle 2 when you did a jump kick, for example, and when you got to Mr. X in Bare Knuckle 2, he's chomping away on a cigar. Both of these things were censored when the game went elsewhere. Here a lot more got cut out, a whole bunch of the plot basically, along with the usual clothing changes and what have you. Some of the enemies were cut out completely in fact, although this might not be a bad thing when you see that Bare Knuckle 3 has one of the absolute worst, most awful looking bosses I've ever seen. I mean seriously, sure it's 1994, but what the hell were you thinking, Sega? It's ridiculous, it's offensive, and it's not even in line with anything else in the series. Good grief. Oh, sorry, one footage. Obviously I was talking about the Mona and Lisa design. But the biggest of all differences between the two versions comes in the way they play, to be honest, and this was something that kinda hurt Streets of Rage 3 a little. It's a very good game for sure, but oh boy is it hard. On the same level as Streets of Rage 1, if not more so. More than that, it's not a particularly good kind of hard. The difficulty comes from things like pointlessly increasing the number of enemies to the point where you have to fight the same trash mob twice in a row from time to comical life bar increases. There is no excuse for a jet fight with 4 bars of energy, especially not on normal difficulty. I mean, just holy hell is it tedious. Bare Knuckle 3, on the other hand, features a level of difficulty that's more in line with Streets of Rage 2. Definitely challenging at points, but it feels a lot more natural where Streets of Rage 3 felt totally artificial. It's for this reason alone that I would highly recommend that you try to play Bare Knuckle 3 as opposed to Streets of Rage 3. It's a much better experience on the whole, much faster paced and just, well yeah, it hasn't been butchered by people who didn't have the faintest fucking clue. But why did the difficulty increase so much? No one knows, to be honest. Things like this just happen sometimes. It's more extreme. With most of the differences out of the way, we can move on to general changes, a lot of which are very good indeed. The special system has been changed once again. You now get a bar that charges up over a short period of time, and if you use a special when it's fully charged, it doesn't cost you any life. Other than that, it's the same as the second game, but this little change does help, particularly in the Western version. Dash attacks have now been rechristened Blitz attacks, and you can actually level them up if you beat down enough goons. They can be very useful. If you have a 6-button padlock, you can use the high power attacks at any time with a button combo. The 6-button pad's highly recommended here actually, as you can also use your strong attack with Y and your back attack with Z. Kinda neat. Also, every character can now run like Skate, and characters also have weapon-based specials too, although weapons no longer last forever, they break after a few uses, which was pretty commonplace for beat-em-ups around this time. And finally, hitting up or down twice gives you a sideways roll, which can be useful in a tight spot. These are all decent tools and they help make the fighting to be very fun indeed. It's just as good as ever really, with nothing taken away. The level design has changed a little though. In fact, Streets of Rage 3 feels kind of like a throwback to the original in this regard. Almost every stage is a left to right affair with no up or down parts, and things like traps and gaps, completely absent in the second game, have returned. The general way that trash mobs come at you is also a bit more reminiscent of the first game. The backgrounds and settings though, they're just better than ever for the most part. They look so damn good. The robotics certainly help matters, but the third game has a bit of a cyberpunk feel going for it that's somewhat different to the other two. It's a bit more fantastical, but the art hasn't suffered for it. All the mega power helps, but there's a dark and rough look to Streets of Rage 3 that really sticks in the mind, even more so than the other two. It's one of the best looking games on the system, no doubt about it. You even get a different final level depending on how you do in the almighty Stage 6, where you have to save the Chief of Police, or a General depending on the version. The final stage changes depending on whether he lives or dies, meaning that there's several different endings. All good and definitely adds to the replay value. There's even some hidden characters. If you beat this Stage 2 sub-boss without killing his aggressive kangaroo buddy, you can play as the kangaroo. A button combo even allows you to play as Ultra Mega Badass Shiva himself, which is quite cool. And yes, another button combo will allow you to play as Ash from the Village People. This is Japanese version only of course, but you can play him in the Western version with the help of a Game Genie. Yeah, help, obviously. And of course you've got that music, which might be the most controversial thing about this whole game. Yuzo Koshiro went full on techno here, with a big smear of industrial thrown in. He ties the FM sound chip in knots, getting every last drop of power from it. He even used a program that created melodies, of a sort anyway, at random, and then stuck those in the soundtrack. The thought was that they'd sound like robots chattering almost, and that would add to this game's feel and its newfound love of all things cyber. Streets of Rage 3 is the most uncompromising soundtrack on the system. It's shrill, it's completely atonal, the hardest parts even make Expander from SOR2 sound like something from a Mahjong game, and I fucking love it. I love every bit of this soundtrack. Nothing else on the Mega Drive even remotely sounds like this. Hell, barely any video game soundtracks at all sound like it. Of course your mileage may vary here. I wouldn't ever pretend that this soundtrack was for everyone. It's tuneless and in many parts it's supposed to be tuneless, but some folks won't ever go for that. If you're into a bit of the old industrial stuff already, you'll probably love it as much as I do. It's not quite at Streets of Rage 2's level, but it's definitely second for me. On the whole, despite the differences between the two versions, this is a fantastic game, once again. If you play Bare Knuckle 3, that comes with no strings attached. It's not all that far away from the second game. If you play Streets of Rage 3, there is a caveat or two. You better be prepared for the high difficulty, and you should probably start off on easy. It's still worth buying though. As with the other two games, it's highly recommended. One of the best beat-em-ups of the whole era, without a shadow of a doubt. Streets of Rage 3 may not have been quite as good as the second game, but then very few games are. Frankly, it was still brilliant, it still sold a fine amount of copies, and it took the series in some new directions to boot. Everything was set up for more Rage to come. Still, it was the middle of 1994. We're now pretty late in the MD's one, and there wouldn't be enough time to get another Rage, or at least one worthy of the series name, out on the system before it was time to move on. So yeah, we should have all looked forward to a Streets of Rage for the next generation. It was one of Sega's biggest series after all. Obviously there was gonna be one, right? What? Well, let's go through the history. Yes, Streets of Rage 4 was always going to be a 32-bit title. There was never any question of another Mega Drive game after 3. The first attempt was by Sega themselves back in the mid-90s. Not a great deal is known about this first shot, but it seems as though it was nixed pretty early on. Some say that the game eventually ended up being rolled into Dynamite Deca, one of the final examples of a beat-em-up gone 3D kicking around. In the West, we know this game better as Die Hard Arcade, the same game with a kind of inexplicable license tacked onto it. The second attempt was a bit shakier. After Sega's first ran aground, they tried to buy a half-finished 3D beat-em-up from Core Design known as Judgment Force, which they were planning to release for the Saturn. The game was superficially similar to Streets of Rage, with a new cast of characters that was still quite similar to the old lot, and some stuff was actually made for this, as you can see in this video here, but the deal ended up falling through right at the last minute. This game eventually ended up being released as Fighting Force, and amusingly it managed to come out on every console except the Sega Saturn. It was kind of a rubbish game on the whole, although there are some little tidbits here and there that are of interest, and that may well come from the time when this was going to be a Streets of Rage sequel. Doesn't this boss here remind you of Jet, for example? In the end, Streets of Rage skipped the 32-bit era completely. A third attempt would come from closer to home, from Ancient, a Sega brand who'd already had a hand in producing the second and third games. They set about making Streets of Rage 4 for the Dreamcast. They produced concept art, they had a first-person fighting mode, they'd even produced a playable segment which you can see in the videos, but again, the idea was shot down, this time by executives. Sega of Japan didn't want it at all, mainly because the series had always been more popular in the West than it was in Japan. So why didn't Sega of America take it? There's a few reasons. The first was the genre, as a lot of people thought that the beat-em-up genre was largely dead, and that attempts to make the beat-em-up genre 3D had largely fallen flat. I guess they were thinking of Fighting Force here, and not just, for example, perhaps the Dreamcast's premiere title, the one that featured a whole shit ton of 3D beat-em-up action. Meh, but I digress. It's not like that game ended up getting a good treatment either, let's be honest. The most ridiculous reason for this project's downfall, apparently, was that Sega of America's executives were largely brand new and hadn't been around back in the day. It's said that they didn't know about Streets of Rage's original success, nor did they care to know. In their eyes it wasn't Sonic, so well, it was obscure. And so the project was dismissed immediately. A more modern attempt to try and revive Streets of Rage was headed up by GRIN, an attempt to remake the original Streets of Rage in souped up 2D form, in much the same vein as their successful BIONIC COMMANDO REARMED games. It was planned to be a download-only title for the PS3 and Xbox 360. However, the project never really got off the ground, and any hope it had would ultimately be crushed by GRIN's liquidation in 2009, for completely unrelated reasons, mind you. A shame really, because what with the success of games like Scott Pilgrim, Castle Crashers, Double Dragon Neon, this would have been a no-brainer surely. In 2011, Ruffian Games, the same folks who made Crackdown 2, no I won't hold that against them, made a prototype video for a fully 3D Streets of Rage reboot, which they ended up presenting to Sega, but apparently they rejected it and the game was cancelled before it even got to pre-alpha stage. The SOR Online website, an absolute goldmine for info on the series, details even more failed attempts: a pitch by retro-liking developers Backbone in 2013, a 249-page petition on behalf of the game's community, a stab at an online version by Bottle Rocket. There's probably even more. None of them even came close to making it through. And well, that's it. That's the story of how the greatest series of beat-em-ups ever made crashed into a brick wall. Just what the hell happened here? Who's to blame? Of course there's one obvious scapegoat. Naturally it's Sega themselves. I guess we all know the story by now. Somewhere around 1995 or so they completely lost control and went into freefall. They completely screwed up the launch of the Saturn and allowed the PlayStation to take control for a start. Even the Saturn's life itself was fraught with abject idiocy. Let's not forget, after all, that the one Sonic game to come out for Sega's supposedly world-beating 32-bit system was a thoroughly underwhelming Mario Kart clone that's mostly remembered these days for its cheesy soundtrack. This was a time when Sega nearly managed to completely derail their golden goose. Even the Blue Bullet wasn't safe.
What the fuck is a Sonic?
So exactly what chance did lesser low still strong IPs like Streets of Rage have? Slim and none, clearly. After the inevitable shake-ups and the attempts to stick a wet band-aid on wounds to the jugular, no one at Sega cared or had any appreciation for their history. They just kept rolling, trying to create endless new IPs and hoping that one of them would come up trumps. Some of these games were freaking incredible, but as far as success went, the sort that Sega needed, they hit 00 every time. Maybe they'd have had more of a chance if Sega had also bothered to look at their past a little. Obviously I'm not saying that Streets of Rage would have single-handedly saved anything, but as something that people clearly wanted, maybe, just maybe, it would have helped. Of all the failed projects, the dismissal of Ancient's work has to go down as the most disappointing. They knew the series, they knew that it worked, and yet it was poo-pooed without a second thought. But well, these were the days when just about any day that ended in Y was usually accompanied by a terrible decision or two from Sega. And so, a new Streets of Rage game never happened. It doesn't look as though it's ever likely to happen, at least not officially. But the fans, they wouldn't let the series die. A small group of them, going by the name of Bomber Games, worked on something for 7 whole years that would pay tribute to the series, and even add some new stuff here and there that would be up to the series standard. And so, if for no reason other than to not end the video on a completely miserable note, we're going to look at the PC-only Streets of Rage remake, a game that's existed in one form or another since about 2004, but was released in its final 5.0 version by Bomber Games in 2011, at which point Sega stepped in with a cease and desist. However, they don't care much about that these days, and you can still happily download the game from SOR Online, and I think you can even download it from Bomber Games' website now. And yeah, Streets of Rage Remake is definitely a high note. It's one of the best fan tributes for a game ever. Built entirely from the ground up with no reverse engineering in the slightest, it literally leaves nothing out. The game features 93 whole stages, including every stage from the 3 games and a bunch of original ones. You can switch from stage to stage, even game to game in the middle of levels. You'll need a whole bunch of playthroughs just to see everything. The game also features 18 characters. Every version of the main characters is available, there's a couple of original creations, the hidden characters from Streets of Rage 3, and you can even play as Mr. X. But to be honest, yeah, the super interesting one is a souped up Adam Hunter, brought in line with his counterparts. If you ever wished that you could play as Adam in Streets of Rage 2, well, here you go. And that's pretty cool. As usual, he's very fun to play as, my favourite character in the first game and my favourite character here. The fighting system is very customisable, with the ability to switch on and off various mechanics from the games, including, oh yeah, that cop car. It may not always be available, but it's pretty cool when it is. By default, it's mostly based off of Streets of Rage 3, which is great and makes for loads of variations, including tons more weapon specials. Even some that seem kind of familiar, like this knife special from Adam. Shinobi 3? Dunno, just saying. And naturally there's all the enemies, all the bosses, and new ones to boot. You can even ride a bike at one point. The plot is fairly unimportant, being the usual stuff about Mr. X taking over and all that, but it scarcely matters when you look at just how much there is here. There's enough to keep any fan of the series going for a long time. You can even use the game's engine to create brand new levels and the like with an editor. And people sure have, even paying tribute to other beat-em-ups along the way. And the graphics, while mostly and thankfully the same as the 16-bit versions, do have a bit of an extra sheen, as well as an added bonus or two. It may not be faithful, but when explosions are cool, yeah, they're pretty cool. Streets of Rage Remake is excellent. Some people have said that it basically is Streets of Rage 4 and should be treated as such, and all things considered, I'm not inclined to disagree. It's just a bit of a shame that Sega weren't all that supportive of it. It's understandable that they'd protect their IPs and what have you, especially seeing as you can still buy Streets of Rage on Steam, Xbox and the like, but well, when that one guy made a fan remake of Sonic CD, Sega ended up working with him and making it official, and the result of that was pretty damn good. So why couldn't they have done the same thing here? Who can say? I always used to say that there was one bigwig in Sega who actually loved Super Thunderblade and wanted to include it everywhere that they possibly could. Maybe that same bigwig absolutely despises Streets of Rage and wants to bury it forever. I don't know. And at last we come to the end. The likelier answer perhaps is that Sega are on the hunt for a white whale. They want something perfect, for all the chips to fall into place, for a Streets of Rage game to be absolutely 100% flawless. Who knows whether it will happen or not. As I said, it doesn't seem all that likely. It's a shame because Lord knows that the demand is still there. There's lots of fans who still want it, who would still want to see a new Streets of Rage, even though the last game was released over 20 years ago. I'm one. I mean, for me it's unquestionably my favourite beat-em-up series. All of those 3 games are brilliant in some way or another, the second game is perfection, and the remake is a glorious tribute. No matter what happens, all of these games will last forever. I have no trouble talking about Streets of Rage for nigh on 50 minutes. It's just that good, and there's so much to say. In the end, if there wasn't ever another Streets of Rage game, anyone can still look back on the series and see, quite clearly, that it's brilliant. A trilogy that never once took a backward step and ended up cashing out at the very top of its game. Streets of Rage will be forever young, its quality will never fade, and it will always be one of the greatest trilogies of games ever made. And maybe, just maybe, things are better that way.